Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. And in this video, we're going to take another look at one of Dr. K's videos, someone who's caught a lot of flack over the past couple weeks because of his commentary and narrative on the Diary of a CEO. For those that don't know about it, I suggest you check it out. And for any recommendations that you want me to review, break it down, or take a look at it, let me know in the comments. Today's video is covering red flags and tackling the perspective of what red flags can mean. This video suggests it might be a good thing. Oddly enough, I tend to disagree. However, let's take a crack at it, take a look, and give our thoughts. So, without further ado, let's check it out. Why chasing red flags leads to love.
Today, we're going to talk about how red flags can actually lead to successful relationships and how green flags can actually sabotage successful relationships.
All right.
So I first noticed this as a psychiatrist when I was working with my patients. And some of them would have really successful marriages, long-term relationships. And as I asked them a little bit about how did you get into this relationship? How did your relationship start? I was stunned by how many red flags were at the beginning of very successful long-term relationships. And even in my own life, I know my wife certainly had a red flag or two. I was basically like a whole parade. I was like addicted to video games, failing out of college, no job after 2 years, being supported by my girlfriend, was going nowhere very rapidly in life. And yet we're still like happily married with 2 kids, and we've been together for like almost 20 years at this point. And so how does that work? Because there's this idea that if there's a red flag in a relationship, you should just dump them and run. If you're ready to take the next step on your mental health journey, check out Dr. K's guide. It's an immersive resource that distills over 20 years of my experience.
I was getting ready to say something, but then he just came out of nowhere.
Your needs. So if you're ready to better understand your mind and take control of it, check out the link in the description below. So it turns out that when there's a red flag early on in a relationship, it leads to problems. And
I think it depends on the severity of the red flag, right? Like, I think that more often than not, men in their adolescence, their young adulthood, tend to be more reckless because they're really trying to find their place in society. They're really trying to find where their feet fit so that way they can start moving forward.
Generally speaking, we think problems in relationships are bad, right? But if you look at what leads to successful relationships over time, it is the ability to navigate through problems. And so one really interesting thing happens in red flags in early relationships. If you voice this problem to your partner 1 month in, 2 months in, 3 months in, then you get to know something that's very, very important that will indicate the long-term health or illness of a relationship, which is how do we navigate problems? And what I've seen in just about all of my patients is when there was a problem early on in the relationship, these 2 people either decide then and there, okay, are we like willing to work through this? Do we have the skills to work through it? Do we have the desire to work through it? And then you kind of navigate in that relationship. You're sort of stress testing the relationship with a red flag really early on. And then that leads to actually very good prognostic signs. In my case, I sort of got my life together when my wife, girlfriend was like, hey, like this is not working. This is the way I can support you. This is what I need to do. And could I swallow my pride and actually make an effort to change for the sake of this person? And so the really interesting thing is that red flags basically stress test our problem-solving capability, which is a really, really good prognostic factor for a successful relationship long-term. Because if you've got someone who's got a red flag and they're willing to actually change, that's someone that you may actually want to spend the rest of your life with. Now let's talk a little bit about green flags, because there's also this idea.
The one thing that needs to be understood as well is like your conflict and the measure of your conflict navigation is what dictates the caliber and status of your relationship. If you're not having any problems in your relationship, that doesn't make it a good relationship. That means that both of you are in contentment and nothing is challenging the powers that be. And if it remains stagnant over long periods of time, eventually that's going to decay and cascade, because that is the phenomenon of linear processing of relationships, where basically you exist, you don't really mesh, and you don't really integrate into one another, and y'all just move like the river down the stream to nowhere. And I think that conflict breeds development. And if you're afraid of conflict, then you're also afraid of the better you or the better relationship.
Idea that, oh, like the better this person is, I'm looking for the perfect partner. And the more perfect they are, the more successful the relationship will be. But I want y'all to just like pay attention to this for a second, right? And think about data. Think about the people that you know who are happily married and the people that you know that are unhappily single or whatever, or in unhappy relationships. And think about what their standards are, right? So when someone's looking for the perfect person, they need to do this, they need to do this, they need to do this, they need to do this. What does that actually do to their relationship prospects? It has really interesting sort of implications for what they end up with. The first problem is that sometimes they find what they're looking for. And why is that a problem? Well, so if I'm looking for like these 6 things and these check my criteria, and you lucky person out there, you check my criteria, you are perfect enough for me, right? You're perfect enough. Therefore, I shall bestow upon you the grace of being able to take me out on a date and buy me things. Right? And so this is what happens, and this person is perfect enough. And if that person is perfect enough, sometimes what happens is we are willing to like bypass a lot of these conflicts. If this person does everything that I want them to do, there isn't a whole lot of conflict early on.
I think that's kind of like dating for convenience, right? When you're looking specifically for it, it's a tough line. It's a tough line in the sand because I could see convenience on one side of the argument, and I can see standards and knowing what you want on the other side. The difference that really intervenes is gender and gender roles, because women will pursue with passionate interests while men typically pursue with interests of longevity. And that's if the man is pursuing on the basis of longevity. That really needs to be understood. I'm not talking about primal instinct. If that man is pursuing primal instinct, then he's also pursuing passionate interests. Both of those fail. That's where hookup culture, that's where hookup culture is born, when both roles are pursuing passionate interests. The issue is that women are always pursuing passionate interests, or more often than not, they're pursuing the things that make them feel good. They're not pursuing the things that challenge them, because pursuing the things that challenge you make you uncomfortable. Naturally, why would you want to be uncomfortable? Well, the better question is, what are you willing to do to be better? And I think that plays the part in regards to what interests equal to better things later on.
So we get into the relationship 6 months later, 7 months later, 8 months later, a year later, 2 years later, and then the cracks start to show in the relationship. This person is perfect, but they do this stuff. But they do this stuff. And this creates a problem, because sometimes what that creates is some kind of conflict, which then either, since you've invested so much time in the relationship, you're willing to like kind of let that slide and let some of that red flag behavior slide because this person is so perfect anyway. Or what happens is y'all end up in conflict, y'all end up breaking up, y'all end up separating.
It's a halo effect. Because of all the other good things that you believe about them, you're going to completely ignore or neglect the things that are completely proving you wrong, that can often be more important.
In some way, because y'all didn't sort of navigate that conflict, because this person is perfect in so many ways. They're a doctor, and they're tall, and they're rich, or they're beautiful, and they've got big tits, whatever, maybe all of the above, right? And then since they have all of these things, they're not willing to compromise because they are worth so much that, hey, it's take it or leave it. If you can't handle me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best. So all these kinds of attitudes start to emerge when people sort of like check a bunch of boxes, and it really delays.
Here's something I gotta say. Here's the thing about, if you're not gonna take me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best. That statement is on a huge basis of lack of accountability. That means I'm not willing to work on myself, and you need to deal with it. Hell no. Get yourself together. No one wants to deal with a hot mess. And if they are, it's because you probably don't really want that person that wants you. And it is in your responsibility to get your life together, so that way you not only can work on you, but you also create a better sense of value in the dating market that exists. Because whether we want to admit it or not, we do have personal values, and then we have values that are contributed to this dating market or this dating realm where we do want to find somebody. Everybody wants to find somebody, no matter what they think and no matter what they believe. Everyone wants someone. And at the end of the day, the only thing that really gets in the way is how bitter we've become about our failures. And if we allow our failures to contribute to a holistic thought process where we just gave up on it, and now we've adopted a new process that's more safe and more comfortable because that doesn't challenge the status quo. That doesn't challenge our current way of thinking. And so we succeed in our potential.
This idea of conflict to later in the relationship, which then means that people will sink in a lot of time, and then this person ends up being not perfect. And so if you're someone who loves all these green flags and you end up with breaking up with someone after 2 years because they're not perfect in some way, what do you end up doing? You end up adding one more thing to the list, right? The problem wasn't that I can't handle conflict resolution or that we couldn't navigate things or I couldn't compromise and maybe lower my standards. Oh my God, that sounds so bad. The internet is telling me that I never have to compromise or lower my standards in any way. That's not the problem. The problem is that this person was perfect in 6 out of...
His pitch on that was a little weird.
6, but I missed number 7. And so now what I'm going to do is look for 7 out of 7. And I really want someone who does this. And then the whole cycle repeats. This person is even more perfect. You know, how do you handle conflict? Oh, I handle conflict great. Great. And then you go 3 years in and then everything falls apart. And now you're running out of time because you're getting older. And now you really need to find the perfect person because you don't have time to wait around and screw around. This is a problem. The second big problem with green flags and people who are looking for the perfect person is that we're oftentimes looking for that person to fix something in our lives. We're looking for that person to be the antidote to a problem that we've got. So a simple example of this is like, you know, let's say finances, right? So I'm looking for a partner who can support me, which is totally fine. Like, I think it's totally fine for one partner to financially support another. But one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen in relationships, and if you want to know what leads to toxic relationships, it's when one person is deriving something out of the relationship that is beyond what the relationship should give. So I should get some amount of love and esteem from my relationship. But if I have core self-esteem problems and can't sit by myself or have really crippling loneliness, and I latch on to this person in a relationship to fix all of my loneliness problems, or self-esteem problems, then that relationship is doomed. Doesn't mean that it can't get undoomed, right? Because those problems can be worked on. But this is something, I mean, maybe y'all have like worked with someone or dated someone who's very clingy, right? And what's going on with...
It doesn't have to necessarily be that they're clingy, but the point is that they approach relationships as transactional and transactional only. You typically see this with people who are narcissists or borderline narcissists, where they see things as a use. They don't see it as a cultivation. And the whole basis of what he's talking about, that cleanliness or that financial requirement, which is typically found on the female side of the house, where women kind of seek that out. Men can seek this out as well if they're a little more feminine. But the point is that when they seek things on the basis of their use, they're never going to be able to actuate or see the potential of the relationship, that it can be so much more to that. And unless one partner in the relationship decides to commandeer it and improve it by willpower, in which case the other person needs to follow suit. It's a tough sale. Hardly happens in today's relationship, but I think that immediate gratification has definitely contributed to the idea that now all we really understand are transactional relationships. It's like, you're here for this, I'm here for this. Cool, let's keep this thing going, but let's not get personally involved. I think that's where a lot of the poly type relationships came into play, because people are so fearful of interpersonal relationships that they need to keep it shallow in order to retain what they think is safety, not realizing that there's a lot of courage that is required for something so much greater, which is obviously a greater bond, and exclusivity and intimacy can be so powerful if you allow it to be.
Clingy. This is someone who requires you for their own self-esteem. And these people will really drain you and drain you and drain you because you don't have to demonstrate just your love, right? You don't have to demonstrate to them that you love them. You have to make up for the lack of love from every other corner of the world. It's like a leech. And that's too much for one person to handle.
Yes,
and so what I've started to see more and more is as people get these really laundry list of requirements, what people are starting to do is almost say like, hey, I'm not going to fix this for myself. I'm just going to find a partner who can fix it for me. And so whether it's financial independence or it's like, I need someone who's going to be available 24/7 and, refuses to go out at night or like is always going to hang out with me first. I need someone who's going to meet all of my emotional needs all the time. These relationships are doomed to fail even if you find what you're looking for. There's one last really interesting thing about emotionally turbulent relationships and why human beings are more attracted to them. This kind of explains why you can't get away from your toxic ex. Right? Your toxic ex is bad for you in a lot of different ways. And so sometimes we're confused, like, why don't I just like stop seeing this person? Why do I respond to their texts? I know it's bad for me, but I can't help myself. So it turns out that there's a lot of really interesting neuroscience and physiology about what attracts us to our toxic exes. So there's a really fascinating study that was done where they had people dating. And the only difference between dates was that one was on a bridge that was made of stone and the other is on a bridge that was like rickety. And what they sort of found is that the emotional fear of the rickety bridge made people fall in love with each other more. That anytime you're in an emotionally unstable environment, it causes people to bond. And so one really interesting thing about red flag relationships, and I know this is true of my relationship, it's true of just about all my patients, is that early like turbulence in the relationship creates actually a lot of negative emotion, and then you'll kind of bind together and work through it. And then you've learned something really, really interesting, which is like, okay, when I'm feeling bad and when they're feeling bad, we're actually a team and we can work through this problem together. And it's also really fascinating because the same principle is why, like, in that emotionally turbulent relationship, it actually provokes attraction, which is sort of why, like, there's this idea that, oh, like, sometimes, like, you're attracted to dangerous people and, like, oh, like, that person's, like, a bad boy or bad girl or, like, like, avoid crazy ladies, right? So bros will say this kind of stuff in, like, locker rooms.
There's a form of appeal to intimidation. That's what he's saying.
Rooms and things like that. They'll use other words, which I'm not going to use here today. And there's some truth to that because there's actually really cool studies that show that emotional turbulence leads to bonding between people. This is also why we see things like trauma bonding. This is also why people fall in love so easily at rehab. I've seen this time and time and time again. And the one rule that I encourage all of my patients to do in rehab is don't fall in love. And at the same time, the number of patients that I've seen, oh yeah, what was the beginning of your relationship like? Well, my partner was addicted to IV heroin, was shooting up every week, and was stealing money from me. And I was like, why didn't you leave them? Well, now they're sober. Y'all have been married for 20 years. 25 years, you've got a 20-year-old kid, an 18-year-old.
Well, that's if they can navigate the conflicts, right? I think that the reason why conflicts early in the relationship allow for better pacing is because that's where you hash out the majority of your conflicts. If it's sunshine and rainbows in the beginning, there's actually something probably wrong there, that either you're faking the funk or they're faking the funk in order to bypass the conflicts that be. In other words, maybe both of you are either too agreeable or maybe one person doesn't care and the other person is morally agreeable. But I think that if there is a lot of conflict in the beginning, it's because there is a lot being integrally placed there. Now, obviously, if there's complete disparity in regards to the personalities that be, that's one thing. But I think the more that's put forth in the beginning, the more of an understanding is there. And it's better to have those heads smash in the beginning than later on, like 4 or 5 years down the road where there's some sunk cost fallacy there. And you're just like, well, I've already been here for this long. I don't want to give up now. It's just like, nah, I mean, it was never addressed. And I think it needs to be addressed. I think that in the beginning is a great time for personalities to clash. That way it's all put on the table of who y'all are and no one has to fake the funk in order to be liked. Because I think that's a problem too. In regards to the trauma bonding, I think the highs and lows of toxic relationships is really what sets the stage for that kind of stuff. Because when things are really low and then they go really high because of passions, or whatever, that comparison and contrast makes you appreciate the highs and start to value that as a saving grace of your relationship in comparison to the lows of that very same relationship, instead of having a moderate incline and decline to your relationship where it's less eventful and there's less of a contrast, because you're not going to be as grateful for the highs if the lows aren't that low. If the lows aren't that low, it's not going to impact you enough, and it's not going to make as much of a difference as those extreme abusive, chaotic lows, and then how y'all manage to reach this peak of perfect unity after the storm, and then you're going to be like, wow, you're going to feel the most, is what I'm saying, at that peak than something that's a little more mild and less conflicting, less chaotic, less traumatizing.
Kid and a 14-year-old kid, oldest is off in college,
which doesn't mean it's good.
They have like this awesome marriage, right? So at the end of the day, I know it's kind of weird, but I encourage you to really think about the impact of red flags on your relationship. I want you to think about the impact of green flags on your relationship. Is this the kind of situation where I'm looking for perfect, and something always falls apart? Are you discounting a large part of the population because they meet some criteria? And if you really think about it, you're losing out on something that's really important, which is finding a partner who's willing to change, who's willing to compromise, who cares about you enough to change a fundamental aspect of their life. And that's probably the kind of person you want to end up with. As a disclaimer, I'm not saying that y'all should chase red flags. I'm not saying that y'all should
I don't know, that thumbnail though. That thumbnail.
If there's someone who's like
Dr. K, looks like you were suggesting
physically abusive or emotionally abusive, that you should continue to date them. I'm not saying that red flags are good, and the more that you have, the better off your relationship is going to be. What I'm saying is that I'm noticing an increasing trend of people looking for perfect.
You better chill on that clickbait.
And the more that they look for perfect, the more that they delay conflict resolution. And if you really look at what leads to prognostically very successful relationships, it's the ability to navigate conflict and compromise. And oftentimes, as we discount people with red flags, we don't give people a chance to change and to grow and to whatever. That's actually shooting us in the foot. So it's just something for y'all to think about and hopefully balance a little bit. If y'all are interested in more, we actually have a whole resource pack on communication in relationships. And we also have a couple of really solid YouTube videos that sort of dive into a couple of these things a little bit more. So check them out.
So that was Dr. K's video. Boy, I still stand on the side that red flags are bad. I think that the severity of the red flags can be very damaging. And I think that the red flags that I consider are the red flags that are far more discreet and deceptive. That is my pitch on the red flags to look out for. Green flags, in my perspective, is as a man, is going to be more feminine women that are more discreet, more reserved. I think these are green flags to trust but verify. All right. And I think that kind of goes with pretty much everything. I don't think that you need to have this laundry list of demands of the partner that you're seeking. I think that there's some fun to being surprised. And there's some fun to finding out that the person that is more different than you is probably the best for you, because the more that we can adopt new perspectives and new methods of navigating life, I think, whether we use it or not, is beneficial to us. I think that it's good to step outside of your comfort zone and look outside of your echo chambers and be able to humbly approach life with new perspectives. And I think that having the entitlement of what you think you deserve doesn't mean you're pursuing green flags. That means that you're just entitled. And I think that you probably need to check your ego and pride when it comes down to the life of another human being. That's a life of another human being, transactional relationship or not. That's another human being. And I think that we often navigate life that way because we have grown to be so selfish in our current societies, where everything has to be about us. And if it's not, then it seems like we don't matter. And it's just like, you need to establish that value for you. that shouldn't necessarily come from another person. And the purpose of relationships is to increase the effectiveness of the people involved. That I think that is the basis of relationships, and that's why they exist. And like I said, I think everybody wants somebody. And I think that being able to establish that, learn from each other, and then continue to move as this greater foundation, I think that's very beautiful. And I think that that's something that can be accomplished by everyone. We just need to develop amongst ourselves, especially as men, for example. You can't walk around with this laundry list of stuff if you haven't worked on you. Who are you to demand these things? And it's the same thing with women. You can't have this laundry list of stuff or even begin to think that you know what men want when you haven't stepped out of your ego or you haven't killed your pride. Because the one thing I've always said is that the thing that gets in the way of relationships in regards to how women can navigate a relationship is that their pride always gets in the way. And it's so hard for them to abandon that when they're getting taught at a young age, no accountability and these other areas. And then with men, it's like there's no examples. They got like no real references anymore, especially with the lack of fathers. And it's just like it's a broken record at this point. Yeah, 100%. But there's so many societal things and poor forms of characterological development that are getting in the way of our ability to have effective relationships. And I want to be very clear about this. We need more effective relationships. We need them. We need better relationships, because if we can establish more effective relationships, then we can also establish more effective families. More effective families leads to more effective societies and communities. It goes full circle. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but the second that we start taking these things more seriously, I think that some good is definitely on the horizon of the norms that we have been seeing lately. So those are just my thoughts. Appreciate Dr. K with another take and another perspective. Please comment, like, and subscribe. If you dislike the video, then dislike it, and hopefully you'll never see me again. But also put your comments in the comment section down below for any of your perspectives, any green flags or red flags that either turn into a good thing or turn into a bad thing for you. I think that we've all kind of stumbled across some pretty bad and some pretty good things that we didn't expect. And I think it's often pretty cool to talk about it, understand each other's viewpoints, and see where we went wrong or we went right. So with that being said, thanks again for watching, and I'll go ahead, see you next time.